Welcome back to Punk Rock Theologian for another episode of Unapologetics, where we don't apologize for truth, but we learn how to represent our King well. Just like 2 Corinthians 5:20 tells us, we are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. And that is a much bigger responsibility than most of us realize. Think about it. An ambassador doesn't represent himself. He doesn't invent foreign policy on the fly, and he doesn't even speak his own opinions. He represents the king, the nation who sent him. Our job as ambassadors isn't to win internet arguments or collect debate trophies. Our job is to remove unnecessary obstacles so people can clearly see Jesus. And today we're talking about a very common obstacle. If you've spent any time talking with skeptics, you've probably heard this one thrown out, usually with some swagger behind it. That's, well, if God created everything, then who created God? People often present this like it's a checkmate, as though Christianity simply falls apart if you can't answer that one conclusively in 30 seconds. And many Christians freeze because they feel like they're suddenly being asked to explain the origin of infinity. But here's the good news. Once you understand what the Bible actually means by God, the question kind of answers itself. Because this question quietly assumes something before it ever asks anything. It assumes that God belongs in the category of created things. It imagines God as one more object in the universe. Maybe it's a really big, really powerful object, maybe an invisible old man sitting on a cloud, but still, it's a being who exists inside reality and therefore must have started somewhere. The problem is, that is not the God that Christianity has ever claimed exists. You see, words and categories matter. If I ask you, what color is the number 7? Or what does Tuesday smell like? You can't answer those questions. And it's not because 7 and Tuesday aren't real, but because the questions themselves are confused. The categories don't fit. Although I have to admit, if you tell me Tuesday smells like tacos, I might accept that answer. It's the same kind of mistake to ask who created the uncreated creator. Long before modern skeptics brought this one up, the Bible drew a hard line between the creator and his creation. In Acts 17:24, Paul stood in Athens among the intellectuals and philosophers and declared, "The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands." God is not a piece of the universe. He stands entirely over it. That's why one of the most helpful responses in a conversation isn't immediately giving a defensive answer. It's asking a clarifying question. What do you mean by God? That is not dodging the issue. It's making sure you're talking about the same thing. Because if someone is describing a giant created superhero in the sky, well, I don't believe in that God either. The God of the Bible is not a created being. He's the eternal creator. Those are two completely different categories. And to see why this category distinction is rooted in reality, we can look at this very simple three-step logical framework called the Kalam cosmological argument. Don't worry about the name. It actually originated in Islam as their proof for the existence of God. But the logic is so sound, theologians have used it ever since. And so it's three pieces. Step one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Step two, the universe began to exist. Step three, therefore, the universe has a cause. Let's break it down a little bit. Step one is just simply how reality works. This is not a religious statement. An effect has a cause. We get that. No one ever expects nothing to cause something. Step two is where modern science completely changed the discussion, because for centuries, many philosophers argued that the universe was eternal. But modern cosmology, from Einstein's relativity to Hubble's discovery of an expanding universe, all demonstrate that space, time, matter, and energy all converged back to an absolute beginning. Most people know this as the idea of the Big Bang, but it matches amazingly well with how scripture introduces reality. The very first words of Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." In fact, a cool side note is that when this science started emerging and started revealing that there was a beginning point to the universe, many scientists resisted it because it sounded a bit too much like the Genesis creation story. But we can no longer deny the evidence. The universe is not eternal, it had a definitive beginning. And that brings us up to step three. If the universe had a beginning, it must have had a cause. You have to start at some point. And eventually, every single worldview has to arrive at something that is ultimate and eternal. Something has to have always existed because nothing comes from nothing. And so now let's take a step beyond it and look at the logic of what that cause would have to be. The cause must exist outside of the universe it creates. Also, for something to create, to cause to exist, time, space, and matter, that would have to be incredibly powerful. It's something coming into being. And so we're looking for a creator that is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and immensely powerful. That is exactly how the Bible describes God's nature. Psalm 92 says, "Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God." That is not poetic exaggeration, it's a basic description of God's nature. And this is where you'll start to get the objections that say, well, believing in this eternal God requires faith. Yeah, it does. But so does every other worldview. If you want to reject an eternal creator, well, then you're still left with this weird miracle of a finely tuned universe that somehow popped into existence out of nothing. And so if somebody mocks a Christian by saying, well, you're telling me God just existed forever, the most logical response is to say, well, something had to. What is your alternative? The real question isn't whether or not something always existed. The question becomes simply what? What always existed? Is it an eternal blind material process that somehow makes happy accidents? Or is it an eternal mind? Scripture actually takes this a step further because it shows us that God is not just this distant clockmaker who wound up the universe and then walked away and let it run out on its own. He is actually the very foundation keeping reality in existence right now. Look at how Colossians 1:16 and 17 describes Jesus. It says, "For in him all things were created. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." Take a second to consider the depth of that. Every atom, every galaxy, every heartbeat, and every law of physics continues to function right now because Christ actively sustains it. And when you navigate this in an actual conversation, it's very important to remember your role as an ambassador. You're trying to clear away a misunderstanding, not score debate points. If someone asks you, who made God? Don't get flustered and don't launch into a 20-minute philosophy lecture. Just slow the conversation down. Show them that that objection is not against Christianity, it's just a misunderstanding of Christianity. Ask, what do you mean by God? And gently explain that the God of Christianity is, by his very definition, the uncaused first cause that everything else depends on. But if we're being completely honest, for a lot of people, this isn't ultimately an intellectual puzzle, it's a personal one. Because, like I've said before, if there really is an eternal creator who stands outside of time and sustains our next breath, well, that means that we aren't the highest authority anymore. Someone else owns the universe. Someone else defines truth. Someone else has the right to tell us how to live. That's exactly what Paul diagnoses in Romans 1:20. We've looked at it before. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Paul's point isn't that everyone becomes a Christian by looking at trees, obviously, but he's saying that creation itself points beyond itself. It whispers that there is a creator. The fact that this exists and that something that began to exist has a cause and the universe began to exist shows that something caused the universe. And there has to be something beyond time, space, matter with incredible power to create a universe. Scripture tells us who that is. If you reject that, you still have to come up with something to be the source. So here's your challenge for the month. The next time you hear the question of who made God, don't get into an argument. Just help them see that we are not claiming God is another creature who needs a creator himself. We're talking about the eternal foundation of reality, the one who never began, the one who caused everything that did begin. Once you clear that obstacle, conversation beautifully shifts from a confused question to the one that truly matters. If the universe had a beginning, what's the best explanation for why anything exists at all? That is a conversation worth having. And as an ambassador, your job is not to win the argument. Your job is to clear the path, speak the truth in love, and trust the Spirit to do the rest.